I realized too late what I lost. It was a quiet morning when I realized what had happened. It wasn't sudden, it wasn't loud. It was a gentle ache, like the soft pull of a thread coming undone. Something I never noticed until it was too late. It happened when my son said something that was so simple, so casual, that I almost missed it. He wasn't angry, he wasn't upset. There was no fight, no raised voices, no slamming doors. There was just a quiet sentence, a soft suggestion. "Mom, I think it's time for you to go home now." And I understood. I understood because deep down, I knew that was the moment everything changed. That was when I finally realized, too late, what I had lost. I stood there for a second, just frozen. I looked at him, my son, who had once been the little boy that needed me for everything. His world used to revolve around me. His eyes would light up whenever he saw me. He would call me just to tell me he loved me, even when he was miles away. But now there was no warmth in his voice, no longing, no need. I smiled, or at least I tried to. I smiled because that's what mothers do, right? We smile through the pain. We hide our broken hearts so no one can see. But the truth was, I wasn't sure how to feel anymore. I wasn't sure how I should respond to the quiet distance that had been growing between us for so long. It wasn't sudden. It was slow, almost imperceptible. It started with a missed phone call, then a few more, then fewer visits, and the conversations became shorter, more strained. I didn't know when I started becoming a background figure in his life. I had always believed that no matter how old they got, my children would always need me, but I never imagined it would fade so quietly, so gently, without me even noticing until it was too late. I never imagined that one day my son would no longer call me mom, that one day I would simply be someone. Growing up, family was everything. It was always us, my husband, my children, and me, the four of us. There was always something to do, always someone to talk to, always someone who needed me. Those years were busy, but they were full of life. The sound of my children's laughter, the clatter of dishes at dinner, the constant hum of activity. I never imagined those days would end. I married young, not out of any grand, sweeping romance, but because it felt right. We built a life together, a small home, simple but filled with warmth, where my children would grow up. My husband worked hard and I stayed home. It wasn't a glamorous life, but it was our life. It was enough. I loved being a mother. I loved the way my children relied on me for everything, for comfort, for advice, for protection. I remember the way they would run to me with scraped knees, how they would always need my attention, how they believed that I could fix everything. That feeling of being needed, of being important, it was something I cherished deeply. When they were young, we had family dinners almost every night. We would sit around the table, eat together, talk about our days, share our little victories and frustrations. There was a rhythm to it, a constant heartbeat of family, and I was at the center of it all. I kept the house running. I made the meals, did the laundry, helped with homework, and kept everyone organized. I was the glue that held everything together, and I was proud of it. I didn't mind the long hours. I didn't mind the tiredness, because I knew I was doing something meaningful. I was building a life for my family. But as the years passed, something changed. I didn't notice it at first. The change was so gradual, like the soft fading of the color in a photograph, until one day I realized it had all but disappeared. The children grew older. They became more independent. I expected that. I wanted them to be independent, to grow, to explore the world on their own. But as they grew more independent, I found myself being pushed aside, not by force, but by time, by their busy schedules, by their friends, by their own lives. And then they moved out. My daughter first. She went to college, and I couldn't help but feel the space in the house grow a little bit larger. Her room stayed empty most of the time, but I never touched her things. I couldn't. I wasn't ready for that change, but I told myself I would be, that this was part of life, that this was what I had raised her for. Then my son left. It wasn't as sudden as it seemed, but it felt sudden. One day he was packing his things, talking about starting his own life, and I was standing in the doorway, holding on to my words. I wanted to say something, to tell him to stay, to beg him to not leave, but I didn't. I watched him go, and I stood there, holding a quiet kind of emptiness. I told myself it was okay, that they would come back, that they would call, but they didn't. Not in the same way. And it wasn't just them. It was me too. I didn't know how to be anything other than mom. When they were gone, I found myself in this quiet house, this empty space that used to be full of noise and love. I filled my days with cleaning, cooking, and keeping busy, but nothing felt the same. As the years went on, I began to notice small signs, subtle things. The way my son stopped calling me every week. At first, it was normal. He was busy. But then I started waiting longer for his calls. The silences grew between us. He didn't come by as often either. His wife had her own family, and I understood that. But I began to wonder if I was still needed. I told myself I was being silly, that this was just part of growing up. Then, one day, it hit me. It wasn't just the silence. It was the absence. The absence of the connection I once had with my children. The absence of the role I had once played in their lives. And then came the moment I'll never forget. The moment I finally realized, too late, what I had lost. It wasn't an argument. It wasn't a confrontation. It was just a quiet, almost forgotten moment where everything became clear. I wish I could say I saw it coming. I wish I could tell you that there was one moment when it all made sense. But the truth is, the distance between us grew so slowly, so quietly, that I didn't realize how far apart we had drifted until it was too late. Looking back now, I can see the small signs, the quiet moments that hinted at the changes. But back then, I missed them. I missed them because I was too busy holding on, thinking that if I just kept doing what I always did, everything would stay the same. But that was a mistake, because nothing stays the same forever. It started with the calls. When my son was younger, we spoke regularly. Sometimes it was just a quick check-in. Sometimes it was about something specific, but there was always a conversation. He would call, and I would listen to him talk about his day, his work, his friends. I loved those conversations. They kept me connected to his life. But then, slowly, the calls became less frequent. At first, I told myself it wasn't a big deal. He was busy, life was busy. He had his own responsibilities, and I understood that. But one day, I noticed it. It wasn't just the missed calls. It was the way he answered when I did reach him. The short responses. The polite but distant tone. I could tell he was distracted, like he wasn't really present during our conversations. I didn't want to admit it at first, but I could feel the distance. It wasn't just in his voice. It was in the way he spoke, in the pauses between his words. I told myself that it was just a phase, that things would go back to normal. But deep down, I knew something had shifted. Then there were the visits. It used to be that he would come home often, Even when he was busy with his own life, he made the effort to visit, to spend time with me. I loved having him home. The house felt alive when he was here. I would cook his favorite meals, and we would sit together at the table, talking about everything and nothing. But as time passed, those visits became fewer and farther apart. I tried not to let it bother me. After all, he had his own life now, his own friends, his own responsibilities. I understood that. But the silence in the house became deafening. There were no more random visits, no more unannounced calls. Instead, I would wait. I would wait for him to call, to visit, to show up the way he used to. But he didn't. And when he did come over, it wasn't the same. It was like there was a wall between us, invisible but real. I could feel the space growing between us, but I didn't know how to bridge it. I didn't know how to make it stop. I didn't know how to fix it. We didn't argue. We didn't fight. There was no dramatic confrontation. It wasn't a falling out. It was just the slow, silent buildup of distance. It was the small things that added up over time, the missed calls, the quiet visits, the lack of conversation, the lack of connection. And as much as I wanted to reach out, to pull him closer, I didn't know how. I didn't know how to fix something that wasn't broken in a way that could be seen. I didn't know how to address the silence without making it worse. So I stayed quiet. I stayed in my corner, watching him from afar, wondering where things had gone wrong, wondering if I had done something to push him away, wondering if I had been too much or too little, wondering if I had just lost my place in his life. I began to feel something I hadn't felt in years: guilt. It crept in slowly, like a shadow at the edge of my mind. I started to wonder if I had done something wrong, if I had pushed him away without even realizing it. I thought about all the times I had put my own needs aside to care for him, to be there for him. I thought about the sacrifices I had made, the moments I had given up for him. Did he even remember those moments? Did he remember the times I stayed up late to help him with schoolwork? Did he remember the countless meals I made, the tears I wiped away, the hugs I gave? Did he remember how much I loved him? I had always been there for him. I had always been the constant, the one person who would never leave. But now I felt like I was the one being left behind. One evening, as I sat alone at the kitchen table, the realization finally hit me. It wasn't sudden. It wasn't like a bolt of lightning. It was quiet. It was calm, but it was real. I had spent so many years being his mother, being needed, being the center of his world, that I forgot to pay attention to how much I was changing. I forgot to pay attention to how much I was being left behind. I thought that if I just kept doing the same things, if I kept being there for him, he would always need me. But that wasn't the truth. The truth was he was growing up. He was building his own life, and I was no longer at the center of it. That was a hard truth to swallow, but it was a truth I had to face. And so I sat at that table, the silence heavy in the room, and I understood something I hadn't before. I had spent so many years thinking that my role in his life was permanent, that he would always need me, that we would always be as close as we once were. But the truth was, he didn't need me in the same way anymore, and I had to learn how to live with that. It wasn't easy, it wasn't painless, but it was real. And so, as I sat there, I let go. Not of him, but of the idea that things would always stay the same. I let go of the guilt, the sadness, and the confusion, and I made room for something new, something quieter, something that was just as important: my own life. It was a simple phone call, but it changed everything. I had been waiting for a sign, for weeks, maybe even months, but it came when I least expected it: a quiet call, a soft voice, and a statement that would stay with me forever. "Mom, I think it's time for you to go home now." My son, my little boy who had once needed me for everything, had just asked me to leave. Not in an angry way, not in a hurtful way, just matter-of-factly. A simple request, a polite, neutral phrase. But to me, it felt like the world had shifted beneath my feet. I was stunned, but I didn't show it. I smiled, or at least I tried to. Because that's what mothers do, don't we? We mask the pain. We cover up the heartache with a smile and a nod, pretending everything is okay. But everything wasn't okay. I stood there, holding the phone, trying to swallow the lump in my throat. It wasn't just the words that hurt. It was the calmness in his voice. There was no warmth, no affection, just a quiet indifference. I didn't know how to respond. I didn't know how to fill the silence that stretched between us. "Okay," I said, my voice barely above a whisper. And then, just like that, the call ended. The line went silent, and I was left standing there alone. I hung up the phone and sat down, staring at the screen as though the words I had just heard would somehow disappear if I waited long enough. It wasn't the first time he had been distant. It wasn't the first time I'd felt that strange, empty gap between us. But this was different. Before, when we talked, there was always something familiar, something comforting. Even when we didn't speak much, we would check in, ask about each other's day, share little things. But now he had just asked me to leave. Not in an angry way, not in a hurtful way, but in a way that made me realize something I hadn't wanted to see before. He didn't need me in the same way anymore. I had always believed that no matter what, I would always be needed, that I would always be at the center of their lives, that no matter how old they got, they would still come to me for comfort, for guidance, for love. But now I realized that wasn't true. My place in their lives had changed, and I had missed it. I had missed it because I was too busy holding on to the past, to the idea of being mom, the one who was always there, the one who was always needed. I didn't know how to feel in that moment. I didn't know how to process what had just happened. It wasn't like a fight or a confrontation. There were no harsh words, no angry shouting. There was just silence, and the realization that I was no longer the center of my son's world. It wasn't until one quiet evening, sitting alone at the kitchen table, that it hit me. It wasn't a loud revelation. It wasn't a sudden burst of clarity. It was a slow realization that unfolded in my mind like a book with pages turning one by one. I had spent so much of my life being mom, the one who was needed, the one who took care of everything, the one who was always there. But now I wasn't needed in the same way anymore, and that was okay. It wasn't easy, but it was true. My son had grown up. He had become a man with his own life, his own responsibilities, and I had to learn to let go, to accept that my role in his life had changed, that he no longer needed me in the same way he did when he was a child. I had to learn to let go of the idea that I was the center of his world. I had to learn to be okay with being just one part of his life, not the whole thing. I had to learn to love him without needing to hold on to him. And that was the hardest lesson I've ever had to learn. The realization was painful, and at first, it didn't feel like something I could recover from. I didn't know how to let go of something I hadn't fully understood was slipping away. For so long, I had held on to the idea of being needed, of being the central figure in my son's life. But that was no longer my role. And the hardest part of it all was acknowledging that truth. The mother I had been, the mother he had depended on, had evolved into something else, something quieter, something more distant. I spent the first few days after my epiphany in a haze of reflection. I thought about every little moment that had led to this, the missed calls, the unanswered texts, the empty spaces where he used to be. I thought about the times I had tried to fill the silence with work, with chores, with anything that would keep me busy and keep my mind off the truth. But as much as I tried to distract myself, the silence never went away. It was always there, lingering, waiting for me to face it. I could feel the weight of it in my chest, the weight of everything that had been left unsaid, of everything I had missed because I didn't want to see it. But I had to face it, and in facing it, I had to learn to let go. I wasn't sure how to do that. I wasn't sure how to accept that my son no longer needed me in the same way, that his life had moved forward, and I was no longer at the center of it. But I knew one thing for sure. I couldn't keep holding on to something that wasn't mine to hold anymore. The first step toward healing was the hardest. It was the step where I had to learn to let go, to release the grip I had on my son's life, even if I didn't want to. I had spent so many years being the one who cared for everything. I had been the person he turned to for comfort, for advice, for help. But that wasn't who I was anymore. I wasn't the one who could fix everything. I wasn't the one who could make the pain go away. He had grown up. He had become someone I was proud of, someone who no longer needed me in the way he once did. And that realization, though painful, was liberating. It was liberating because it allowed me to step back and see my role in his life for what it was now. I wasn't gone. I wasn't invisible. I was still his mother, but my role had changed. I began to understand that this was part of life, that children grow, they leave, they build their own families, their own worlds. And as a mother, my job was never to hold them back. My job was to give them the tools they needed to live on their own, to make their own decisions, to find their own paths. And in letting go of the mother I had been, I began to rediscover who I was too. I wasn't just a mother. I was a woman with a life of my own. I was someone who had once had dreams, who had once had passions, who had once been more than just the caregiver. But somewhere along the way, I had forgotten that. Somewhere along the way, I had lost myself in the role I had played. It took time, but I started to piece myself back together, slowly, carefully, bit by bit. I began to spend more time with myself. I went for walks. I read books I had always meant to read. I spent hours in the kitchen experimenting with new recipes. I took long baths just to feel the water on my skin, to remind myself that I was still here, still alive, still worthy of love. I began to find joy in the quiet, in the small moments. The more I let go of the expectations I had set for myself, the more I began to understand the power of acceptance. Acceptance didn't mean giving up. It didn't mean resigning myself to a life of loneliness. It didn't mean abandoning my son or my family. It meant accepting that change was inevitable, that life moves on, and that I couldn't control everything. Acceptance meant learning to live in the space between what was and what could be. It meant finding peace in the quiet moments, in the small victories, in the things I still had. And as I accepted this new reality, I began to heal. I began to understand that my son's life didn't have to be mine for me to love him. I didn't have to be at the center of his world to know that he cared for me, to know that he loved me. But for that to happen, I had to give him space. I had to allow him to live his own life, even if it meant stepping back and allowing that space to grow between us. That was the hardest part of the process, stepping back and letting him go. But it was also the most important part, because in giving him that space, I began to give myself space too. One afternoon, I sat down at my kitchen table, a cup of tea in hand. The house was still. The air was warm with the light of the late afternoon. And I thought about the past, about everything I had done for my son, for my family. But for the first time in a long while, I didn't feel sorrow. I didn't feel anger. I didn't feel resentment. I felt peace. I realized that, in my own way, I had done everything I could. I had given him everything I had. And even though things were different now, even though my role had changed, that didn't mean my love for him had diminished. It had only grown. I wasn't ready to fully let go of everything, but I didn't have to. I just had to let go of the idea that things would always stay the same. I had to accept that we both had changed, and that change didn't have to be painful. It didn't have to be something to fear. It could be something to embrace. I began to think about the future, about the possibilities that lay ahead, for both of us. It took time, but I began to heal. Healing wasn't something that happened overnight. It wasn't a sudden moment of clarity or a dramatic shift in the way I viewed things. Healing was a slow, quiet process. It was learning to be kind to myself, to forgive myself for holding on too tightly, to forgive myself for not letting go sooner. I spent more time with my friends, rekindling old relationships I had neglected. I found joy in the small things, in cooking, in reading, in taking long walks through the park. I began to remember who I was, not just as a mother, but as a woman. And that, too, was an important part of the journey. The more I let go of expectations I had set for myself, the more I began to understand the power of acceptance. Acceptance didn't mean giving up. It didn't mean resigning myself to a life of loneliness. It didn't mean abandoning my son or my family. It meant accepting that change was inevitable, that life moves on, and that I couldn't control everything. Acceptance meant learning to live in the space between what was and what could be. It meant finding peace in the quiet moments, in the small victories, in the things I still had. And as I accepted this new reality, I began to heal. I began to understand that my son's life didn't have to be mine for me to love him. I didn't have to be at the center of his world to know that he cared for me, to know that he loved me. But for that to happen, I had to give him space. I had to allow him to live his own life, even if it meant stepping back and allowing that space to grow between us. That was the hardest part of the process, stepping back and letting him go. But it was also the most important part, because in giving him that space, I began to give myself space too. One afternoon, I sat down at my kitchen table, a cup of tea in hand. The house was still. The air was warm with the light of the late afternoon, and I thought about the past, about everything I had done for my son, for my family. But for the first time in a long while, I didn't feel sorrow. I didn't feel anger. I didn't feel resentment. I felt peace. I realized that, in my own way, I had done everything I could. I had given him everything I had. And even though things were different now, even though my role had changed, that didn't mean my love for him had diminished. It had only grown. I wasn't ready to fully let go of everything, but I didn't have to. I just had to let go of the idea that things would always stay the same. I had to accept that we both had changed, and that change didn't have to be painful. It didn't have to be something to fear. It could be something to embrace. I began to think about the future, about the possibilities that lay ahead, for both of us. It took time, but I began to heal. Healing wasn't something that happened overnight. It wasn't a sudden moment of clarity or a dramatic shift in the way I viewed things. Healing was a slow, quiet process. It was learning to be kind to myself, to forgive myself for holding on too tightly, to forgive myself for not letting go sooner. I spent more time with my friends, rekindling old relationships I had neglected. I found joy in the small things, in cooking, in reading, in taking long walks through the park. I began to remember who I was, not just as a mother, but as a woman, and that, too, was an important part of the journey. Acceptance didn't come easily. It was something I had to work at every single day. But over time, I came to realize that this new chapter in my life wasn't the end. It was just another beginning. I had lost something, yes, but I had also gained something. I had gained the strength to move forward, the strength to see my son as his own person, and to allow myself to be my own person too. I had learned that love isn't about holding on. Love is about letting go, even when it's hard, and knowing that the love you share will never fade. And so, with that realization, I found peace. I found peace in the quiet. I found peace in the space between us. And most importantly, I found peace in myself. It's funny how, when you're in the middle of something, you can't see it for what it really is. It's only when you step back, when the dust settles, that the picture becomes clearer. And in that stillness, you begin to see everything that has changed, everything you've lost, but also everything you've gained. I spent so many years holding on to the idea that my children would always need me the way they once did. But what I failed to realize was that they needed me in different ways as they grew older. And the hardest part wasn't their growing independence. The hardest part was my own inability to let go. But the truth is, letting go doesn't mean you stop loving. It doesn't mean you stop being there. It means you create space for them to live their lives. It means you create space for yourself to live yours. I used to think that if I wasn't needed, then I had no value. But I now understand that being needed isn't what gives life its meaning. The love we share, the quiet moments, the bond that exists, that is what truly matters. And as I sit here, looking back on everything, I realize that I wasn't losing my son. I was gaining something else. The opportunity to let him grow, to let him be who he needed to be without holding on too tightly. I realized that sometimes we have to give our loved ones the freedom to change, to find their own path, even if that means stepping back. That's the most profound gift we can give them. And in return, they give us the gift of seeing them become the people they were always meant to be. There's a kind of peace that comes with silence. Not the silence that feels empty or painful, but the kind of silence that follows acceptance. The kind that tells you it's okay to be quiet for a while, to reflect, to just be. I used to think that silence meant I was forgotten, that when they didn't call, when they didn't come by as often, I was being left behind. But I've learned that silence doesn't always mean absence. Sometimes silence is just the space where love is still felt, even if it's not always spoken. I spent years filling my life with noise. I filled it with caring for others, with doing everything I thought I was supposed to do. But in the quiet, I found a different kind of peace, a peace that allowed me to hear my own thoughts again, a peace that allowed me to rediscover who I was before I became mom, before I became someone's caretaker. And in that peace, I realized that I didn't need to be needed all the time to be loved. Love is a quiet thing sometimes. It's not always loud. It's not always in the form of words or actions. Sometimes love is simply in the shared silence, in the understanding that we are still there for each other, even from a distance. It's not easy to embrace change. It never is. We're creatures of habit, and the familiar feels safe. But life doesn't wait for us to be ready. It keeps moving forward, whether we want it to or not. The hardest part of this journey wasn't realizing that my son no longer needed me the way he once did. The hardest part was learning to accept it, learning to accept that change was not something to fear, but something to embrace. When we hold on too tightly, we suffocate the relationships we care about most. I had held on to the past, to the idea that things would always be the same, that I would always be needed in the same way. But the truth is, holding on to something that's already changed only causes pain. I had to learn to let go, to give my son the space he needed to grow, And in doing that, I gave myself the freedom to grow as well. It wasn't easy. There were moments when the silence felt too heavy. There were moments when I missed the closeness we once had. But as I learned to accept the changes, I began to see the beauty in them. I began to see how much he had grown, how much he had become his own person, and I realized that as his mother, that was my job all along, to help him become who he was meant to be, not to hold him back. As much as this process was about accepting the changes in my relationship with my son, it was also about rediscovering who I was. I had spent so many years being defined by my role as a mother, by the needs of others. But now, in this space of quiet, I had to learn what it meant to be me. I started taking time for myself, real time, not the hurried moments I used to steal between everything else. I went for walks, sat in coffee shops, read books I had forgotten I loved. I started writing again, something I hadn't done in years. I picked up old hobbies I had abandoned, and I made new ones. I found joy in small things, in moments of solitude, in the simple pleasure of doing things for myself. And slowly, I realized something I hadn't allowed myself to see before. I was enough. Not because I was needed, but because I existed, and that was enough. I wasn't just mom. I was still me, the woman who had dreams, the woman who had a voice, the woman who had a life before children and family took up all the space. And it was time for me to step into that again, to remember who I was outside of my roles. It wasn't easy. There were days when the silence felt overwhelming. There were days when I missed my son terribly, when I wished things could go back to how they once were. But I had learned that life isn't about going back, it's about moving forward, finding new paths and learning to appreciate the moments we have, even if they aren't the same as before. Healing isn't a straight line. It's not something that happens quickly or neatly. It's a messy, winding process, full of moments of growth and moments of struggle. But what I've learned is that healing doesn't mean forgetting. It means accepting what is, while still holding space for what was. I healed by finding peace in the quiet moments. I healed by finding joy in the simple things that I had once overlooked. I healed by reconnecting with my passions, my dreams, and my sense of self that had been buried for too long. But most of all, I healed by letting go of the idea that I had to be needed in the same way. I had to stop measuring my worth by how much I was relied upon. I had to stop defining myself by the roles I played and start defining myself by who I truly was. And as I healed, I began to see my son in a new light. I began to understand that his distance wasn't a rejection. It wasn't a sign that I had failed. It was simply part of his journey and part of mine. I couldn't change the past. I couldn't undo the things I had missed, but I could change the future. I could embrace the changes, the growth, and the space that we both needed. And I did. As I sit here now, reflecting on everything that has happened, I realize that the journey I've been on wasn't just about losing my son's closeness, it was about finding myself again. It was about learning to let go, not just of my son, but of the idea that I had to be needed in the same way. I've learned that love doesn't have to be loud. It doesn't have to be constant. Sometimes love is quiet. It's in the moments of silence, the shared understanding, the knowledge that even when we're apart, we're still there for each other. I don't need to be the center of my son's world. I just need to be part of it. And that's enough. I am enough.